God never approved polygamy. He regulated it, and exactly once he set a limit. That law is in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18, and it forbids, in plain words, the exact marriage of the man who fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, the patriarch, and nobody ever condemned Jacob, not one word in all of Genesis. 5 pieces, 60 minutes, the patriarchs, the laws, the single restriction God wrote and who it was aimed at. What ancient Judaism itself did with these texts, and what Jesus answered when they asked him. The 4th piece is the one that changes the whole picture. This channel reads the text as it is, even when it stings, and it reads from the conviction that Jesus is the Messiah. That doesn't change a single word of what we're about to see. It changes where the video ends. Before we go on, do me a favor. If what you just heard made you doubt something you took for granted, leave a like. I'm not asking you to agree with me. I'm asking you to mark that this is worth discussing. And if halfway through you decide I'm wrong, take it back. That seems fair. We're family here, and family argues. Because first you need to understand what the text says, not what gets preached. The text. And I want you to sit with what I just told you. The law God handed down at Sinai forbids, in writing, the marriage arrangement of the man whose new name, Israel, is the name of the entire nation. And that man never received a warning, never a rebuke. The 4th piece comes from manuscripts found in the Judean desert. Because there were Jews 600 years before a single Christian church existed who read these same verses and reached a devastating conclusion about King David. And there's a question that's going to hang over everything from here to the end. Israel wrote a law that set a limit. It's there, in the scroll, in ink. And it was never once applied to any of the men who received it. Not one. Hold on to that question. We're going to answer it, and the answer isn't where you expect it. Now let's go back to the beginning. And the beginning is not Abraham. 1st piece, the men who did it. The first man in the Bible with 2 wives is not a patriarch. He's not a king. He's a murderer. His name is Lamech, and the text introduces him in chapter 4 of Genesis, in the line of Cain, 7th generation from the first killer in history. And the narrator does something worth noticing, because it's deliberate. He places the news of Lamech's 2 wives right up against a speech Lamech makes to those same women. Picture it. A tent, smoke from the fire rising straight up because there's no wind, and a man standing in front of his 2 wives. He calls them by name, Ada and Zillah, and demands that they listen. And what he tells them isn't a promise, it's a threat aimed at the whole world. He tells them he has killed a man for wounding him, a young man for leaving him a bruise. And then he does the math. If Cain would be avenged 7 times, then him 77. That is the first time the Bible records a man with more than 1 wife. And the narrator doesn't comment. He doesn't say it was wrong. He doesn't say it was right. He sets it beside a boast about bloodshed and moves on, leaving you to draw the conclusion. This is going to repeat for the entire video, so get used to it now. Genesis almost never tells you what to think. It shows you. And where it places things is how it gives its opinion. Now, Abraham, the man that Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition all call the father of faith, had children by 3 different women, by Sarah, by Hagar, and by a woman named Keturah, about whom the text says almost nothing. And on top of that, chapter 25 mentions in the plural certain concubines whose sons Abraham sent east with gifts, away from Isaac. That detail matters more than it looks, and we'll come back to it. But the episode that counts is Hagar's, because it's the only one where somebody complains. Sarah has gone years without children. The promise has been made, the heir doesn't come, and she makes a decision that in the ancient world was completely ordinary. She hands her Egyptian slave to her husband in order to have offspring through her. This isn't a slip or an exotic temptation, it's a legal procedure. Hagar conceives, and something breaks. The text says Hagar began to look at her mistress with contempt, and then Sarah goes back to her husband and says something that sounds like a courtroom, that the wrong she's suffering fall on him, that she herself put her slave in his arms, and now she's despised, and may the Lord judge between the two of them. Stop there for a second. That phrase, may the Lord judge between you and me, is a legal formula. Sarah is demanding a divine verdict. She is saying in legal language that an injustice has occurred and that God has to rule on it. And here's what the text does next. God doesn't rule. There's no answer, no judgment, no voice from heaven telling Abraham he was wrong, or Sarah she was wrong, or that the whole arrangement was wrong. What there is, a few verses later, is an angel who finds Hagar alone in the wilderness beside a spring of water, running, pregnant, and tells her to go back to the same house, to the same arrangement. That's the pattern, and you'll see it again and again. The text records the pain with brutal precision and issues no condemnation. And here we need to put the world around the text, because without that none of it makes sense. What Sarah did had a legal name in her time. And this is exactly a point where people have overreached for decades. For a long time, it was repeated that the Nuzi tablets in northern Mesopotamia contained marriage contracts obligating a barren wife to hand her husband a slave girl. The reality is smaller. Out of the thousands of tablets published from that archive, there is exactly one with that clause, and Assyriologists themselves acknowledge it's atypical within the collection. In the 1970s, Thomas Thompson and John Van Seters dismantled a good part of those parallels, and we now know the custom also shows up in Assyrian texts from the 7th century, which means it can't even date the patriarchs. So if somebody tells you Nuzi proves the Hagar story, they're stretching one tablet until it tears. What is solid is something else, and it's stronger. The code of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, centuries before Moses, legislates this exact scenario across consecutive articles. If a man marries a priestess who cannot bear children, and she gives him a slave who does, he may no longer take an additional wife. If she gives him none, then he may take another, but that second woman can never claim equal rank with the first, and if his wife falls ill and he wants to take another, the law forbids him to put the sick woman out of the house. That is not a stray tablet. That is a law code. So when Sarah hands Hagar to her husband, she isn't inventing anything or falling into some exotic temptation. She's executing the standard procedure of her age, the one any childless woman with means would have executed in Ur, in Haran, or in Nuzi. This doesn't excuse the outcome, but it completely changes the question, because the question stops being why these people did something so strange and becomes something much sharper. Why did God, looking at a practice he could have banned with a single sentence, choose not to ban it and to regulate it instead? Hold that question. It governs the rest of this video. Let's keep going, because the list is longer than most people imagine. Nahor, Abraham's brother, had children by his wife Milcah and by a concubine named Roimah. The text mentions it in passing at the end of a chapter, like someone jotting down a civil registry entry. Esau, Jacob's brother, took Canaanite wives and later a daughter of Ishmael. The narrator notes that those women were a bitterness of spirit to Isaac and Rebekah, but look closely at the reason for the bitterness. It isn't the number, it's the origin. What bothers them is that the women were Canaanite, not that there were several. There's one more detail about Abraham that explains a great deal. At the end of his life, the text says he gave everything he owned to Isaac, and that to the sons of his concubines he gave gifts and sent them away eastward while he was still alive. Read that for what it is, an estate operation. The sons of the second-rank women receive compensation while he lives and are cut out of the main inheritance. They're removed from the house before the patriarch dies, so there's no dispute over the division. It was an effective solution, and it was exactly the kind of solution the law, centuries later, would forbid when it legislated about the son of the unloved wife. In other words, the practice created a problem. The family solved it however it could, and later, legislation came in to put a brake on the way they were solving it. That sequence is going to repeat until the end of this video. And now, Jacob. And here the subject stops being a genealogical footnote and becomes an open wound lasting 20 years. Jacob arrives in Haran, fleeing his brother. He works 7 years for Rachel. On the wedding night, his father-in-law hands him the older sister Leah. When dawn comes and Jacob discovers the switch, he negotiates another 7 years and ends up with both sisters. And then, in the race to have children, the servants of both women enter too. Bilhah and Zilpah, 4 women, 1 house, and the text lets us hear what happens inside it. Because Genesis does something extraordinary at this point. It gives us the names of Leah's sons, and with each name, the sentence she spoke as she named him. 4 sentences in a row, and read in order, they form one of the saddest things in the entire Bible. The first she calls Reuben and says the Lord has seen her affliction, that now her husband will love her. The second she calls Simeon and says the Lord heard that she was despised. The third she calls Levi and says that now, this time, her husband will be joined to her because she has given him 3 sons. The fourth she calls Judah and says only that this time she will praise the Lord. Listen to the progression. Now he will love me. I was despised. Now he will be joined to me. And at the end, silence about the husband, only praise. Leah stops asking. In 4 names, a woman passes through hope, humiliation, pleading, and surrender. And from that 4th son, born when she had already stopped expecting to be loved, comes the tribe of King David and of the Messiah. The text doesn't comment on that either. It just puts it there. There's one more scene in that house, and it's the one that best shows what the arrangement did to those 2 sisters. Reuben, as a boy, finds mandrakes in the field during the wheat harvest and brings them to his mother. Mandrakes were, in the ancient world, a plant associated with fertility. Rachel sees them and asks Leah to give her some. And Leah answers with a sentence that has been building for 20 years. She asks whether it seems a small thing to have taken her husband, that now she wants to take her son's mandrakes too. Think about that. Leah is saying Rachel took her husband. And Rachel, technically, was the first promised, the one Jacob chose, the one he loved. Both of them feel robbed by the other. Both are right from where they stand. And they're sisters. They end up negotiating. Rachel sells Leah a night with the husband they share in exchange for some plants. That's the level of decay. And the narrator, once again, says not one word of judgment. Now, in the middle of all this, there's a detail the text doesn't underline, and it's the most eloquent silence in Genesis. Isaac, Abraham's son, Jacob's father, the middle link in the chain of the 3 patriarchs, had one wife his entire life, Rebekah. And he never took another, not even during the 20 years she was barren. 20 years. The exact same situation that led his father to take Hagar. And he did something different. The text says he prayed for his wife. Genesis doesn't flag this. It doesn't say Isaac did right or that the others did wrong. It simply builds, in the middle generation, a contrast that sits there for anyone who wants to see it. And it doesn't end with the patriarchs. This went on for centuries with people the text treats with enormous respect. Elkanah, the father of the prophet Samuel, had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. The text presents him as a devout man who went up every year to worship, and on the same page it tells us that Peninnah provoked Hannah until she wept and wouldn't eat, year after year, for being barren. And that house deserves a stop, because it's the only one in the Old Testament where we watch the arrangement working from the inside, year after year, in a religious and perfectly ordinary family. Elkanah went up every year to the sanctuary at Shiloh with his whole household, and the text describes the moment the sacrificial portions were handed out with a detail that hurts. To Peninnah he gave her portion, and to each of her sons and daughters theirs. Several portions, one per head. To Hannah he gave a double portion, because he loved her, even though she had no children. Picture that table. One woman surrounded by plates, with the living proof of her fertility seated beside her, and across from her another woman alone, with a larger serving and no child to give it to. Elkanah's gesture was love, and it was, at the same time, a public humiliation of the other woman, year after year. The text says her rival provoked her, angering her and grieving her because the Lord had not granted her children, and that this repeated every year, every time they went up to the house of the Lord, until Hannah wept and would not eat. And then the husband, who clearly understood nothing, asks her the question that sums up the whole problem. He asks why she's crying, why she isn't eating, why her heart is grieved. And he finishes by asking whether he isn't better to her than 10 sons. It's a tender line, and it's completely useless. Because Hannah's pain wasn't coming from a lack of affection. It came from sharing a house with someone who used her fertility as a weapon, and from the fact that the man who loved them both had no way to fix that without wounding one of them. There are no villains in that scene. Elkanah is devout, Hannah is innocent, Peninnah has children and doesn't have the love, which was the only thing that gave a woman security in that society. The arrangement produces the suffering without anyone needing to be wicked. And out of that woman crying at the table came the prophet, who would anoint the first 2 kings of Israel. There's one more episode in Jacob's house, short and easy to skip past, and it's the best answer to this video's question in all of Genesis. Reuben, Leah's firstborn, the boy with the mandrakes, now grown, sleeps with Bilhah, the servant his father had taken as a concubine. The text narrates it in half a line, and then it writes 4 words, and Israel heard of it, and it cuts off. No reaction, no punishment, no speech. The narrator notes that the father found out and moves immediately to something else, to the list of Jacob's sons, as if nothing had happened. In the Hebrew manuscripts, there's even a break mark in a place where it shouldn't be, in the middle of the verse, as though the scribe wanted to leave a record of the silence, and that silence lasts 40 years. Jump to the end of the book. Jacob is dying. He gathers his 12 sons around his bed to bless them, and he starts with the eldest, as he should. He tells Reuben he is his firstborn, his might, the beginning of his strength, excelling in dignity and excelling in power. And then, in the same breath, he turns. Unstable as water, you shall not excel because you went up to your father's bed, 40 years later. The old man had forgotten nothing. He was only waiting for the moment when speaking would carry irreversible consequences. And when he spoke, Reuben lost the birthright, which is everything a firstborn has. Now apply that to everything we've seen. The text's silence about Abraham, about Jacob, about the 4 mothers, is not permission. It is exactly what Jacob's silence was for 40 years, an account still open. And the genealogies in Chronicles are full of names like these, recorded without a word of comment. Jerahmeel with 2 wives, Caleb with named concubines, Asher, the father of Tekoa, with 2 wives, Manasseh with an Aramean concubine. Not one of them gets a note of disapproval, not one. Before we move on, there's something to correct, because the impression this list leaves is misleading. If you read the Old Testament straight through, you come away with the feeling that every Israelite was walking around with 3 or 4 wives, and that's false. The biblical text records kings, patriarchs, judges, and notable families. In other words, the elite. And the reason the elite is what shows up is economic, not spiritual. Every wife meant a bride price, an enlarged household, and lifelong support for her and her children. Roblon de Vaux, in his classic study of Israel's institutions, concluded that the practice was legal but minority, concentrated among those who could pay for it. And household archaeology points the same way. The typical Israelite houses that have been excavated, those four-room houses that turn up by the hundreds at Iron Age sites, don't accommodate large homes with several family units. The size of a house doesn't directly prove the number of wives of the man who lived in it. It's an indication, not a demonstration. But the whole picture points one direction. The ordinary Israelite had one wife, not because a law commanded it, but because he couldn't afford anything else, which leaves the matter exactly where it stood. If the practice belonged to the rich and to kings, then the only written restriction, the one we're about to see, is aimed precisely at the people who could afford it. So up to here, the defense has a solid case, and it has to be said plainly. If somebody tells you the Bible condemns the patriarchs for having multiple wives, that person isn't reading the text. They're reading what they were taught about the text, but the comfortable part ends now, because there is a verse in the law that reads slowly, describes with surgical precision one specific marriage in Genesis. Leviticus 18 is devoted to forbidden unions. It's a list of relations, the mother, the sister, the daughter-in-law, the aunt. And in the middle of that list, in verse 18, this appears, "Do not take a woman together with her sister to make her a rival, uncovering her nakedness while the first is alive." Read it again, thinking about Jacob, two sisters, rivals, both alive at the same time. It is the exact description, point for point, of the marriage of the man who gave his name to the people who received that law. The law of Israel forbids the marriage of Israel. There's an easy way out here, and it doesn't work. Somebody will say, Jacob lived before Sinai, there was no law yet. Correct, that's true. Nobody is accusing Jacob of breaking a rule that didn't exist. But that doesn't resolve anything. It only moves the problem, because the question isn't whether Jacob sinned. The question is why the same God who would later write that prohibition never said a single word about it to Jacob while it was happening. God spoke to Jacob several times. At Bethel, at the ford of the Jabbok, at Beersheba, he changed his name. He repeated the promise, and he never mentioned the subject. That is not a legal vacuum. That is a chosen silence. Hold on to this, because in the fourth piece, we're going to meet a group of Jews who read this exact verse and drew a conclusion that neither the synagogue nor the church drew in 2,000 years. Second piece, what the law actually wrote. There is an enormous difference between forbidding something and regulating something. And that difference is the heart of this entire subject. When a law forbids, it says, don't do this. When a law regulates, it says something completely different. It says, this is going to happen. And when it does, here is what you're required to do. To regulate is to admit the practice exists. And the law of Moses, on the subject of multiple wives, regulates 3 times, in detail, without a single word of general prohibition. The first is in Exodus 21, and it's blunt in a way that's uncomfortable. It deals with the case of a man who has taken a woman and then takes another. The text doesn't tell him not to. It says that if he does, he cannot reduce the first woman's food, her clothing, or her conjugal right. And it adds a clause that was radical in the ancient world. If he fails her in those 3 things, she goes free, paying nothing, no money involved. Think about what that means. The law is not telling the man to avoid taking another woman. It's telling him that if he does, the first retains enforceable rights, and that if he defaults on them, she leaves and he loses everything he invested. That's a protection. And a protection only makes sense if the thing it protects against is going to happen. And that third item on the list deserves a straight look, because the Hebrew is harder than the translations let on. The word is onah, And it appears exactly once in the entire Old Testament. Once. There is no other passage to compare it against. The ancient versions, the Greek, the Syriac, and the Aramaic Targums understood it as the woman's conjugal right, and that's the reading later Judaism fixed as an enforceable obligation on the husband. But there's another serious proposal, that it means ointment, oil. Because in several ancient Near Eastern texts the formula food, clothing and ointment appears as the basic trio of maintenance, and some read it as housing. Nahum Sana, in his commentary on Exodus, lays out all three possibilities and settles on the traditional one because it's the earliest documented reading. I lean there too. But it is not a closed case. And anyone who presents it to you as closed is handing you a certainty the text doesn't have. And here's the interesting part. Under all three readings, the legal effect is identical. There is something the arrival of a second woman cannot take away from the first. And if he fails her in any of the three, she goes free, and the text insists, without money. Nor did this come out of nowhere. The laws of Lipit Ishtar already established that a man who took a second wife, now his favorite, remained obligated to support the first. Israel didn't invent the protection. What it did was extend it downward, all the way to the purchased woman, who was the last link in that household. And that tells you what the law cared about. It wasn't designing the ideal marriage. It was preventing the woman who ended up in second place from being left with nothing. The second text is in Deuteronomy 21. And here, the language is so direct it's harsh. It speaks of a man who has two wives, and it uses two words to describe them. One loved, the other hated. In Hebrew, they're two participles, and there's no way to soften them. The law takes for granted, as if it were obvious, that in a house with two wives, there will be a favored one and a rejected one, and it legislates on that. It says that if the firstborn is the son of the hated one, the father cannot skip him to give the double portion to the son of the one he loves. He has to acknowledge the eldest, whether he likes it or not. Once again, it's a protection for the son of the woman who isn't loved. And once again, not a word against the arrangement itself. And I want you to stop on the word the law chose, because it's harder than it sounds in English. The Hebrew verb translated, hated, is sane. It's the same verb used for hatred between enemies, not the one he wants less, the hated one. Now, in ancient Near Eastern legal language, that word also carried a technical sense. In marriage contracts of the period, it was used to designate the displaced wife, the one who had lost her position, without necessarily implying any emotional hatred. Both things live in the text at once, and neither of them is pleasant. And notice who the law legislates for. Not for the man, who already has the power. Not for the favored wife, who already has the affection. It legislates for the son of the displaced woman, so that his father cannot punish him for the crime of being born to the wrong mother. That's the hand of the law in this matter, and it shows up all three times. It always protects the one at the bottom of the arrangement without dismantling the arrangement. And this is where someone is going to say, with every right, if God could dismantle it, why did he only patch it? That objection is correct, it's ancient, and it has an answer that won't arrive until the last stretch of this video, spoken by someone with the authority to give it. Hold it until then. Now the matter gets genuinely interesting, because there's a third text, and specialists have been arguing seriously about that third one for 40 years. Back to Leviticus 18, verse 18, the one that describes Jacob's marriage. In Hebrew, the key phrase sounds like this, Isha el Achotah, and the literal translation, word for word, is a woman toward her sister. Almost every Bible in your house renders it as a woman and her sister, taking sister in the family sense, by blood. Under that reading, the law forbids one very specific thing, marrying two sisters. And by forbidding only that, it would be implicitly permitting everything else. 2 wives, yes, as long as they aren't sisters to each other. That's the majority reading. It's the one in most translations and the one most Hebraists hold today. But there's another reading, and it isn't a modern invention. In biblical Hebrew, the expression Isha elatotah sometimes functions as a distributive formula with no family content at all. It's the way of saying one toward the other, each with respect to the other. It appears that way in the tabernacle instructions, describing how the curtains are joined to one another, and obviously nobody there is talking about blood sisters. If the verse works that way, then it doesn't say, "Don't take 2 sisters." It says, "Don't take a woman alongside another as a rival, while the first is alive." And that is no longer a rule about kinship, it's a general prohibition. The Italian scholar Angelo Tossato defended this reading in a 1984 article in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly, and his strongest argument isn't grammatical, it's logical. The reason the law itself gives is to keep one from becoming the other's rival. And rivalry doesn't depend on kinship. 2 women who aren't sisters can be rivals in exactly the same way. In fact, the same term Leviticus uses for rival is the one the book of Samuel uses to describe the relationship between Hannah and Peninnah, who were not sisters. Gordon Hugenberger, in his study of marriage as a covenant, arrived by another route at a similar conclusion, and Richard Davidson gathered the whole body of evidence in his work on sexuality in the Old Testament. This still remains, even so, the minority reading. Most specialists in biblical Hebrew don't accept it, and they have a weighty argument in their favor. The verse is embedded right after a very long list of incest prohibitions, and in that context, the natural sense of sister is sister. I can't settle that debate, and I'm not going to pretend I can. What I can tell you is this: the Hebrew text admits both readings, the argument is real and it's old, and the practical result is that Leviticus 18 is neither the clean prohibition some people would like, nor the clean permission others find convenient. There's a 4th text, much weaker, and I mention it precisely because I don't want you telling me afterward that I hid it. In 2 Chronicles 24, about King Joash, the text says he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of the priest Jehoiada, and then says Jehoiada took 2 wives for him. The Hebrew conjunction joining the 2 clauses, the letter vav, can mean and, but it can also mean but. If it's translated but, the verse would be hinting at disapproval. It's possible. It's also possible it isn't. It's a fine-grained argument resting on a single letter, and I wouldn't build anything on top of it. Noted, and let's move on. And before we get to the one restriction, we need to clear up a word, because half the confusion about this subject comes from there. The Hebrew text distinguishes between the wife and what our Bibles translate as concubine. The word is pilegesh, and it doesn't mean mistress or affair. It designates a woman joined to the man in a stable and recognized way, who lived in the house and whose children could inherit, but with a lower legal status. Normally without a bride price and with fewer guarantees if he died. It isn't a clandestine relationship, it's a rank. That's why concubines appear in the official lists, in the genealogies, and in the household registers of the royal court. Nobody was hiding them. And that's exactly why taking a king's concubine was a grave political act, nearly a declaration of succession, as you see when Abner is accused of approaching Saul's concubine and reacts as though he'd been accused of treason. Hold on to that distinction, because when we reach Solomon's 1,000 women, you'll see that the text carefully separates the 2 groups. And that separation carries a meaning that's lost if you read the whole thing as one undifferentiated pile. And now we reach the center. Because in all the law of Moses, in all 5 books, there is exactly one written restriction on the number of wives. One. And it isn't addressed to the people. It's in Deuteronomy 17, in the passage specialists call the law of the king. It's a remarkable text because it legislates about a monarchy that doesn't yet exist, and it sets the future monarch 3 limits. He shall not accumulate horses, he shall not accumulate silver and gold, and he shall not multiply wives for himself. The Hebrew verb is rabba, to multiply, to increase. And the law gives the reason, which is the most important part of all, so that his heart does not turn away. Notice what just happened. The one time the law of Israel sets a limit on the number of wives, it doesn't do it out of sexual morality. It does it for national security. The danger isn't desire. The danger is that a king's marriage alliances drag his loyalty toward other gods. And here I owe you an honest note. That verb, multiply, is ambiguous, and it always has been. Does it forbid having more than one, or does it forbid having too many? Most interpreters, Jewish and Christian, have understood that it forbids excess, not plurality, and that reading makes sense because the same law uses the same verb for horses and for silver, and nobody has ever thought a king of Israel was forbidden to own a horse or a coin. So the limit exists, but it's written with a blurred edge. Hold that thought, because in the 4th piece, you're going to watch a group of Jews sharpen that edge into a razor. And before we move to the kings, I want you to notice where we're standing. We have a practice recorded across centuries. We have 3 laws that regulate it and assume it. We have 1 restriction, ambiguous, aimed exclusively at kings, and we have 0 divine condemnations against any patriarch. If the video ended here, the answer to the question in the title would be simple. God tolerated it, and that's that. And we could already say it in the words we started with. God never approved it. He regulated it. And exactly once, he set a limit. The problem is that the sentence is still incomplete, and it stays incomplete until you see who that limit was applied to and what it cost. Because there is a king who was told everything by name, and there is a verse where God himself, through a prophet, says something about another king's wives that is going to make everybody uncomfortable. If you've made it this far and you want the rest, subscribe now. What's coming is the missing piece. 3rd piece, the kings, and the hardest verse in the Old Testament. David had, at minimum, 8 wives with names on record, plus a number of concubines the text doesn't bother to count. The book of Samuel lists them at Hebron without any embarrassment, along with the son each one gave him: Ahinoam, Abigail, Maacah, who was the daughter of a foreign king, Haggith, Abital, Eglah. Before them there was Michal, Saul's daughter. Afterward would come Bathsheba. And when the king moves to Jerusalem, the narrator notes, almost in passing, that he took more concubines and more wives. That man is the same one described as being after God's own heart. And now comes the verse, the one that has to be read whole, because it usually gets quoted cut in half, and it is by far the hardest piece of evidence in this entire subject. Context. David has already done the worst thing he ever did. He slept with another man's wife, and then had that man killed to cover it up. The prophet Nathan walks into the palace, tells him the parable of the poor man's lamb. David becomes indignant and condemns himself without realizing it. And Nathan drops the 4 words on him, "You are the man." And then Nathan begins speaking in the first person, in God's name. He reminds him of everything he was given. He tells him he anointed him king, that he delivered him from Saul's hand. And in the middle of that list of divine gifts, he says this: "I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms." Read it again. God, through his prophet, includes the previous king's wives in the inventory of what he himself handed to David. And the strongest part is still coming. Nathan adds that if that had been too little, he would have given him much more. That is not a grudging concession. It's an offer. I don't have a comfortable way to explain that verse to you, and I'm not going to invent one. It's there. It's biblical text, And anyone who tells you the Bible is uniformly hostile to multiple wives has to step over this sentence to hold that position. What I can show you is what Nathan says immediately afterward. Because the rebuke does come, and it's ferocious, but look carefully at what it accuses him of. It doesn't accuse him of having many wives. It accuses him of two concrete things: of killing Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites, and of taking his wife. The sin God names is not plurality, it's theft and homicide. David wasn't condemned for having 8 wives. He was condemned for wanting the 9th, who belonged to someone else. That distinction is uncomfortable for every side, and that's exactly why it has to be said. And there's something else, something the narrator builds with chilling patience. In that same sentence, Nathan announces the punishment. That out of his own house evil will rise against him, that his wives will be taken from him before his eyes and given to another, and that what he did in secret will be done in broad daylight. Now move forward a few chapters. Absalom, his son, has rebelled, has taken Jerusalem, and his advisor counsels a brutal political act to prove the break with his father is irreversible. They pitch a tent on the palace roof, and Absalom goes into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel, on the roof, which is exactly the place from which David, chapters earlier, saw Bathsheba bathing. The narrator never says it. He doesn't have to. He put the same roof in both scenes and waited for you to notice. That's Genesis and Samuel working the same way. The theology is in the architecture, not in the commentary. And now we have to look at what that house produced, because the book of Samuel devotes entire chapters to showing it, and it isn't pleasant. David's sons were not full brothers. They were half-brothers, each from a different mother, raised in the same palace and competing for the same throne. And the narrator recounts in detail what came out of that. Amnon, son of Ahinoam, assaulted Tamar, who was the daughter of another mother. The text narrates it without sparing the cruelty, and records that the father, on finding out, was very angry, and there it stops. It doesn't say he did anything. 2 years later, Absalom, Tamar's brother on the mother's side, had Amnon killed at a banquet. Think about the mechanics of that. The violence didn't cross the house at random. It followed the maternal bloodlines exactly. Each mother was a faction, and it doesn't end there. Adonijah, son of Haggith, tried to seize the throne while his father was still alive. Solomon, son of Bathsheba, had him executed shortly after coming to power, and the pretext was a request to marry the last woman who had cared for the aging king. 4 mothers, 4 sons, 3 dead. And this repeats outside David's house. Gideon, according to the book of Judges, had many wives and 70 sons. When he died, one of those sons, born to a woman of Shechem, killed his 69 brothers on a single stone to take power for himself. 70 sons, one survived by hiding. And Solomon's grandson Abijah had 14 wives, according to the chronicler, who once again records it without a word of moral comment. I want you to see the full pattern, because it's the strongest argument in the entire Old Testament on this subject, and it isn't in any law. Every time the Bible narrates in detail a house with several women, that house breaks. Sarah and Hagar end up separated by a desert. Leah and Rachel negotiate over a night. Hannah weeps and won't eat. David's sons kill each other. Gideon's sons die on a stone. There is never a condemnation. There is always a bill, and a bill that comes due 5 times in the same book stops being a coincidence and starts being a thesis. And now, Solomon. Here the ambiguities end. 700 wives of royal rank and 300 concubines, 1,000 women, and the text explains where they come from. Alliances, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites, and the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt. Every marriage is a treaty, every woman is a secured border, And the first book of Kings does something it had done for no one until that moment. It cites the law. It says Solomon loved many foreign women and then recalls that the Lord had said he was not to unite with them because they would turn his heart after their gods. That is the language of Deuteronomy 17, the exact reason, so that his heart does not turn away. And you have to understand the mechanics, because this was not appetite, it was state policy. In the ancient world, a treaty between two kingdoms was sealed with a marriage. The daughter of the weaker king entered the house of the stronger, and that woman was, literally, the living guarantee of the agreement. As long as she was well treated, the pact held. Solomon inherited a kingdom with no standing army comparable to his neighbors and with long borders, and he built his security by marrying the borders: Egypt to the south, Moab and Ammon to the east, Sidon to the north, Edom in the desert. The text carefully separates the women of royal rank from the concubines. The first are treaties, the second are not. And with every treaty, something more than a woman came in. Her household came in, her servants, her court, and her worship. Because in that world, nobody demanded that a foreign princess abandon her gods. It would have been a diplomatic humiliation. The normal thing, the thing the treaty itself required, was to give her a place to worship. Solomon didn't choose between national security and faithfulness. He convinced himself he could have both, and for decades it looked like he was right. The kingdom prospered, the temple went up, the treaties held. And then comes the line that seals everything. When Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart after foreign gods. It wasn't a fall, it was a 40-year erosion. And that's the frightening part of this passage. It doesn't describe a man who rebelled against God. It describes a man who conceded one altar at a time, each with an impeccable political justification, until one day he looked out from his own temple and saw the horizon full of shrines he had authorized himself. Stop and picture the scene, because the text gives you the data to reconstruct it. An aging king, the wisest man of his generation, the one who built the temple, the one who prayed at its dedication that even the foreigner would be heard, and that same man climbing the hill east of Jerusalem, facing his own temple a short distance away, to raise altars, one for Chemosh, the god of Moab, another for Moloch, the god of the Ammonites, and shrines for the deities of every one of his foreign wives, so each of them could burn incense to her own. From the temple courtyard, those altars were visible, facing each other. And here is the point that makes Solomon the decisive case of this entire video. God had already spoken to him. Twice. He appeared to him at Gibeon when he was young and granted him the wise heart he asked for. And he appeared a second time after the temple was finished, to warn him expressly what would happen if he or his sons turned away and served other gods. And that second appearance is worth spelling out, because it's what makes this case different from every other one. It happened after the temple was completed, when Solomon was at the summit. And the message was not congratulations. It was a warning with explicit conditions. He was told that if he or his sons turned from following him and served other gods, he would cut Israel off from the land he had given them, and the house he had just consecrated would lie in ruins, and everyone who passed by it would be appalled and would hiss and would ask why the Lord had done this to this land and to this house. In other words, the king received in person an advanced description of the catastrophe. He was told the ending before it started. And here is the contrast that governs this entire third piece. With the patriarchs, there was silence. With Solomon, there was a written law, 2 appearances, and a detailed warning. The difference between them isn't what they did, it's what they were told. That's why the judgment falls on him and not on Jacob. Not because his marriage was worse, but because he knew. So when the sentence arrives, no ambiguity is possible. The Lord tells him that because he has not kept his covenant, he will tear the kingdom away and give it to his servant. And that is the answer to the question I left hanging at the beginning. I told you Israel wrote a law that set a limit and never applied it to the men who received it. That was true up to this exact point in the story. The law was applied once in all of biblical history. And when it was applied, the price wasn't paid by a man. It was paid by the entire nation. The kingdom split in two and never came back together. If this is stirring something in you, write it below. I genuinely want to know at what point in this video you stopped being sure of what you believed when you started. And there's still one detail left, a small number that looks insignificant and that you're going to need in 5 minutes. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, the king in whose hands the kingdom broke, had 18 wives and 60 concubines. The chronicler records it without scandal, like one more administrative fact. 18. Remember that number. I didn't choose it. Fourth piece. The ones who read the same thing and concluded the opposite. Before we go in, something you need to know. Almost none of what follows is in the Bible. These are Jewish manuscripts written by people who were arguing about the Bible. I'm not bringing them because they carry the authority of sacred text. I'm bringing them because they show how the text was read, and that is exactly what we're investigating. Let's slow the pace for a moment, because I need you to move with me in time and on the map. We leave Jerusalem, we go down eastward, toward the Dead Sea Depression, where the air is heavy and the heat is like no other heat. On a limestone terrace facing the water, long after the kings and long before Jesus, there lived a community of Jews who had separated from the temple because they believed the temple was contaminated. They kept their writings in caves. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd looking for a lost goat threw a stone into one of those caves and heard a jar break. Among what came out of there, and out of what had already been found decades earlier in Cairo, there is a document specialists call the Damascus Document. And in its fourth column, there is a passage that completely changes the conversation we're having. The text says, Belial let loose 3 nets over Israel, and it names them fornication, wealth, and defilement of the sanctuary. And it explains that whoever escapes one falls into the next. Then it spells out what the first net consists of, and what it says is this. They are caught in fornication by taking 2 wives in their lifetimes. There it is. No hedging. A Jewish group, 2 centuries before our era, classifying plurality of wives as fornication, as a trap set by the enemy. And it's worth understanding who they were, because the weight of the testimony depends on it. This group was at odds with the rest of the Judaism of their time about nearly everything. They followed a different calendar of 364 days, which means they kept the festivals on different dates from the temple in Jerusalem. They regarded the serving priesthood as illegitimate. Their purity rules were far stricter than any other current we know of. In other words, they were radicals, and they were radicals on purpose. That cuts both ways, and it has to be said. On one side, it costs them representativeness. You can't cite them as the voice of ancient Judaism because they weren't. On the other side, it adds something important. They were obsessive readers of the text with a ferocious interpretive discipline, and they didn't reach this conclusion through cultural pressure because the culture around them ran in exactly the opposite direction. They got there by reading. And the other 2 nets they name, wealth and defilement of the sanctuary, show how they thought. They weren't compiling a list of loose sins. They were describing 3 mechanisms by which someone who believes himself righteous ends up trapped without noticing. The trap, in their reading, never presents itself as sin. It presents itself as normal. And the dates matter. The oldest surviving fragment of this document was copied in the first half of the 1st century before Christ, and the text itself is probably older. This is not a late reaction to Christian preaching. It is older than Christianity. But the truly extraordinary thing isn't the conclusion, it's how they get there. Because if you had to prove from the Hebrew Bible that having two wives is forbidden, you would have a serious problem. We've already seen that the general prohibition isn't written anywhere, and they solve it with three moves. The first, they go back to the very beginning. They cite Genesis 1 and say the foundation of creation is that male and female, he created them, one and one. They argue from design, not from a prohibition. The second move is bolder still. They go to Noah's Ark and observe that those who entered went in 2 by 2, one pair per species. They use the structure of a narrative as a legal argument. And the third, they cite Deuteronomy 17, the law of the prince, they call it. He shall not multiply wives for himself. Do you see what they did? They took that blurred edge restriction we left pending a while ago, the one that only spoke of kings, and they sharpened it into a rule for everyone. If the king can't, nobody can. And then comes the finishing stroke, and it's one of the boldest sentences an ancient Jew ever wrote about the most beloved king of his people. They ask how it's possible that David had so many wives, if the law said that. And they answer that David had not read the sealed book of the law. They're saying the king didn't know, that the text was sealed, stored away, unopened, and that David therefore acted without the knowledge. It's a defense and an accusation at the same time. They absolve him of the guilt, and in doing so, take for granted that what he did was forbidden. And that idea of the sealed book deserves a moment, because it's stranger than it looks at first. What they're arguing is that there was a long period in Israel's history during which the scroll of the law was closed, unopened, and that men like David therefore acted without knowing it. It's an explanation built to solve a problem they had created for themselves. If the law forbade plurality of wives, how could the most important king in the nation's history ignore it, his entire life, without consequences? The solution was historical, not theological. He didn't know, and that is enormously revealing. It shows a group of ancient readers uncomfortable with exactly the same silence that makes us uncomfortable. More than 2,000 years ago, someone sat down in front of the same problem you have in your head right now and wrote a way out. You weren't the first to notice, and it isn't an isolated document. Among the same scrolls, another long text appeared, the one known as the Temple Scroll, which rewrites entire sections of the law. When it reaches the law of the king, it leaves no margin at all. It says the king shall take one wife, that he shall not take another besides her, and that she alone shall be with him all the days of her life. And it adds that if she dies, then he may take another. Compare that with Deuteronomy, where the biblical text says, you shall not multiply. This one says one, and only one, while she lives. That isn't translation, it's correction. And there's something about that scroll you have to see to believe. Deuteronomy is written as a speech by Moses. Moses speaks, and when he refers to God, he does it in the third person. The Lord said, the Lord commanded. The Temple Scroll eliminates Moses. It rewrites the same laws in the first person, as if God were speaking directly, with no intermediary. Which means that when that text says the king shall take one wife, and she alone shall be with him while she lives, it isn't presenting it as anyone's interpretation. It's presenting it as direct speech. They didn't believe they were correcting the law. They believed they were restoring what the law had always said before somebody read it wrong. That's what makes this group so uncomfortable to study and so valuable. They weren't innovators. They considered themselves the last conservatives. Now, one caution. Everything I've just described belongs to a minority. Their reading was not the common reading, and I don't want you leaving here thinking all of Second Temple Judaism forbade multiple wives, because that would be false. In fact, we have the proof of the opposite, and it comes from a Jewish historian of the 1st century, Flavius Josephus, writing for a Roman audience, explains without any embarrassment that it is his people's ancestral custom to have several wives at the same time. He says it the way someone describes a normal tradition, not the way someone confesses a shame, and he knew what he was talking about. Josephus described up close the court that governed Judea when Jesus was born. Herod the Great had close to 10 wives, and Josephus recounts that palace's dynastic intrigues in a detail that reads like tragic theatre: sons by different mothers, crossed accusations, executions inside the family. The same pattern, again, 1,500 years after Jacob. And a century later, a Christian named Justin, arguing with a Jew in a written dialogue, throws it in his face that the teachers of his people still permit a man to have 4 or 5 wives. So the real picture is this: the practice remained legal, it kept existing, and at the same time there were internal currents pushing the other way, and those currents won. Slowly, but they won. This is where the number I asked you to remember comes back. When the rabbis codified the oral law in the Mishnah, they devoted a passage to the king's limits, and on wives they fixed an exact figure, no more than 18. 18, the exact number of wives Rehoboam had. And where did that figure come from? The Mishnah doesn't explain it. It simply fixes it. The explanation comes later in the Talmud, and it's arithmetic performed on the uncomfortable verse. They counted the 6 wives David had at Hebron, 1 for each son the text attributes to him there, and they added Nathan's promise, that line about God having given him much more. In Hebrew, that line repeats the same expression twice, like these and like these. If each one is worth 6, then 6 plus 6 plus 6 makes 18. The rabbis turned the verse most favorable to plurality of wives into the foundation of their limit. And even that arithmetic didn't hold. In the same discussion, one sage asks why not read each of those expressions as 12, which would give 24. And another opinion is recorded that leaning on one more letter of the text arrives at 48. 18, 24, 48. 3 different figures from the same verse on the same page. And as if that weren't enough, in that same tractate, another rabbi uses that very verse for something completely different, to argue that a king may marry the widow of another king because that's what David did. Beyond the arithmetic, there was the substantive argument. One rabbi holds that the king may go past the limit as long as the women don't turn his heart away, and another answers that he may not take even a single one if that one is going to turn it. Listen to the second position, not even one. The criterion is no longer the number, it's the heart, which is word for word the reason Deuteronomy had given 1,000 years earlier. The closing of this story takes another 1,000 years. Around the year 1000 of our era, a rabbi of the Rhineland remembered as Rabbeinu Gershom issued a formal ban on polygamy for the Jewish communities of Europe. It wasn't a new revelation. It was a legal decision taken in a Christian setting where the practice was already socially impossible, and it didn't reach everyone. The communities of North Africa, Spain, Yemen, and Iraq went on permitting it for centuries longer. Now put it all together, because this is the entire point of this fourth piece. For more than 2,000 years, Jews reading exactly the same scrolls you have at home reached conclusions that contradicted each other. Some permitted it, others called it a net of the devil. Some set the limit at 18, others at 1. And not one of them could point to a verse where God says clearly, don't do this. Because that verse doesn't exist. What exists is something else. And to see it, we have to go to the one place we haven't been yet. Fifth piece. The sentence. Go back to the 2nd chapter of Genesis. Before Lamech, before the patriarchs, before there was a law, a king or a scroll. After forming the woman, the narrator stops and does something he hasn't done. He steps out of the scene and comments. He says that for this reason a man leaves his father and his mother, joins himself to his wife, and they become one flesh. One flesh, singular. And there's a textual detail here worth explaining. In the Hebrew text our Bibles use, the phrase literally says, "and they shall be one flesh," without specifying how many they are. But the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Greek translation of the 70 say, "and the two shall be one flesh." The two, with the number written in. We can't know with certainty which of the two forms is original, and anyone who tells you otherwise is flattening a textual argument that is still open. What we do know is which of the two Jesus quoted. They ask him about marriage. It's a loaded question out of the rabbinic schools about valid grounds for divorce. And he doesn't answer the question they asked. He skips the entire law of Moses, skips the patriarchs, skips the kings, and goes to the origin. He says that from the beginning he made them male and female, and that for this reason a man leaves his father and his mother and joins himself to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. Stop on what just happened. Jesus has just chained Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, created male and female, and the two shall be one flesh. They are the exact two texts the Dead Sea community had chained together in that same order to argue against multiple wives. And here there's a line that can't be crossed. This doesn't prove Jesus knew that document or that he depended on it. What it proves is that the argument from creation was in circulation in the Judaism of his time, and that he took it and used it as an authority, standing above the legislation of Moses. And then he adds the sentence that closes this entire video's circle, "so they are no longer two, but one flesh. What God has joined together, let no man separate." And there's a detail in how the second gospel tells it that reinforces the point. In Mark's version, Jesus doesn't start by citing Genesis 2. He starts further back still, saying that from the beginning of creation, he made them male and female. Meaning, the authority he invokes is not a law or a prophet or a school tradition. It's the act of creating itself. And when his own disciples ask him again in private, he doesn't soften anything. This has a consequence worth saying out loud. Through this entire video, we have been hunting for a prohibition, and we didn't find one. And it turns out Jesus' answer wasn't to find a prohibition hidden in the law. It was to say that the law on marriage had been working below the original design from day one, and that he was returning to the design. That is an enormous claim of authority, and his hearers understood it perfectly. When they object that Moses permitted divorce, his answer is sharper still. He says Moses permitted it because of the hardness of their hearts, but that from the beginning it was not so. There you have it, in a single sentence, the key to everything we've just walked through. To permit is not to approve. To regulate is not to bless. The law worked with real men in a real world, and set limits where limits could be set, protecting the unloved wife, the son of the rejected womb, the slave who had been handed over. But the pattern from the beginning never changed, and it was written on the second page. In the New Testament, there is one last piece. When Paul writes to Timothy the requirements for the one who oversees a community, he includes a Greek expression translated husband of one wife. And that expression has been understood in three ways across history. That he not be polygamous, that he not have remarried after being widowed, or simply that he be faithful, a one-woman man. Most current specialists prefer the third, and there's something worth noticing. It's a requirement for those who lead, not a law for everyone. In the first century, in the Greco-Roman world, legal polygamy was no longer the norm. Paul isn't legislating against it. He's describing a character. And there's one more piece of evidence that closes this from another direction. When Paul wants to explain to a community what marriage is, he cites no law of Moses. He cites that same verse from Genesis, the one about one flesh, and applies it directly. It's the same text again, the one from the beginning. Genesis 2 doesn't function in the New Testament as a curious fact about the origin of the world. It functions as standing law. It's the argument returned to every time the subject comes up, and that answers the objection I left pending half an hour ago about why God only patched instead of dismantling. Because according to Jesus' answer, the pattern was never repealed. It was written on the second page and it stayed there intact while the law worked at a lower level with hardened men. The legislation dealt with the damage. The design never moved. To permit was not to approve. It was to wait. So here is the answer, whole, with nothing added. God never approved it. He regulated it, and exactly once, he set a limit. There is no divine condemnation against any patriarch. There is no general prohibition in the law. There are 3 regulations protecting women inside a practice the ancient world took for granted. There is one restriction aimed at kings with the reason written down, so that the heart does not turn away. And there is one king to whom that restriction was applied, and the kingdom split. And above all of it, depending on no law at all, stands the design of Genesis 2, verse 24, the one Jesus went back to when they asked him. This channel exists to read the text as it is, even when the text doesn't say what we'd like it to say. And the position we read from is no secret. Jesus is the promised Messiah. He said so himself when they asked whether he was the Christ in Mark 14, verse 62, and he answered yes. And when he wanted to settle an argument about marriage, he didn't cite the patriarchs or the kings. He cited the beginning. In the end, the question that opened this video had a trap in it, and by now you'll have noticed. To ask why God never condemned polygamy assumes that silence is approval. And Genesis has spent 50 chapters teaching you to read silence a different way. Lamech beside his boast about blood. Sarah asking for a verdict that never comes. 4 sons' names that are 4 stations of a humiliation. 2 sisters negotiating a night in exchange for some plants. A rooftop in Jerusalem where the same thing happened twice. 20 years and 1 prophetic sentence apart. God said nothing. But the narrator never stopped showing you the price, page after page, across 1,500 years of history. And when someone finally did speak plainly, it wasn't to condemn Abraham. It was to say that from the beginning, it was not so. If you want to keep seeing what the text actually says, the next video is already on your screen.